April 1945, the Ruhr pocket was choking on its own smoke. German guns still thundered from the ridges even as the front collapsed. In the chaos, a boy who barely looked 17 crawled beneath a Sherman tank, wrench in one hand, a half-burned rag in the other. Oil streaked his face, ash clung to his hair. Around him, men twice his age shouted for cover. A shell landed close enough to shake dust from the hull. He didn't even flinch. The tank had to move, or the entire column would be sitting ducks. The field smelled of diesel, blood, and wet mud. Allied armor from the 10th Armored Division stood crippled in a shallow valley. 20 tanks silent, hissing steam through cracked radiators. The boy slid under another Sherman, boots scraping gravel. "Move it, kid!" Someone yelled. He didn't answer. His mind was locked on the stripped fuel line in front of him. The wrench slipped, cutting his knuckles. He ignored the blood. Time was the real enemy now. In less than 24 hours, they needed those tanks rolling again. Reports said the Germans were regrouping with what little they had left: panthers, artillery, and desperation. The boy's task was madness, but the division had no backup mechanics. They had him, and he wasn't leaving anyone behind. A captured German soldier, watching from the roadside cage, muttered through cracked lips, cane-soled. "At so jung sollt noch arbeiten, no soldier that young should still be working." Another guard looked away. Everyone could see it, the absurdity of war made flesh in a teenager fixing monsters of steel. By dusk, sparks from his torch glowed like fireflies against the dying light. Each clang of his hammer was a heartbeat of defiance. He worked through pain, through exhaustion, through the thick smell of cordite and mud. The front line moved without him. He made his own front line beneath steel. But as darkness fell and the tanks around him lay silent, one question burned louder than the engines ever could. How did a kid end up here, mending war itself? Tomorrow, the story would rewind to a recruiting office, a lie, and a stamped form that changed everything. The story rewinds to 1944 Kansas plains, summer dust swirling outside a one-room recruiting office that smells of coffee, ink, and floor polish. Inside, the boy sits on a metal chair, legs too thin for the army boots beside him. The recruiter squints at the form. 17, he asks. The boy nods. The man shrugs, presses the stamp down hard. Approved, and slides it across the desk. Outside, cicadas buzz as if nothing historic has just happened. In that single motion, a farm kid became government property, and the machine of war gained another gear. He'd watched newsreels showing P-51 Mustangs diving like silver hawks, B-17s blotting the sky. The posters promised duty, glory, a man's purpose. Nobody mentioned oil burns, freezing nights, or the smell of scorched rubber. His father had fixed tractors. He could fix anything. That was his ticket to the front, Mechanic Armor Division, the tag on his duffel read when the train left Topeka. By autumn, he was at a training depot in Georgia. The humidity hit like steam from a locomotive. Drill sergeants barked, wrenches clanged. He learned to change a Sherman's transmission faster than most men could tie their boots. 60,000 parts per tank, and he memorized each like scripture. Reports estimate more than 200 zero underage volunteers slipped through the cracks during WWII, too eager or too desperate to wait for adulthood. He was one of them, and he wore that secret-like armor. German officers later mocked America for sending boys, not men. In their reports, they called it weakness. They didn't understand what hunger for purpose could do to a mind that hadn't yet hardened. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing belonging. The sound of engines gave him that. Nights before deployment, he'd sit by the barracks window sketching tank parts on scrap paper. Outside, trains wailed, carrying others to Europe. One sergeant paused behind him and muttered, "Kid, you'll either fix 'em or die under one." The boy just nodded. In his mind, machines were simpler than people. Broken things could be fixed. Months later, when his transport ship neared France, He'd think back to that stamped paper and wonder if the recruiter ever remembered his face. The kid who lied to join would soon lie under fire literally. April 1945. Grey skies over Kassel, Germany. The road was mud and twisted steel, littered with burnt helmets and broken tracks. A convoy of Sherman tanks groaned to a halt, engines coughing black smoke into the cold air. The rain came sideways, mixing with oil puddles that shimmered like spilled gunmetal. The boy engineer, barely 18 now, jumped down from a jeep, toolkit banging against his leg. 20 Shermans stretched down the road. The armored spearhead of the 10th Armored Division, now silent, wounded and exposed. He knelt beside the first tank. Fuel line split. Next one, transmission jammed. The third had thrown its track completely. Sniper rounds cracked somewhere in the distance, sharp like hammers on tin. His sergeant yelled, "Stay down." He didn't. He crawled under the steel belly, scraping his elbows against cold armor, feeling the vibration of nearby gunfire through the hull. Time ticked like a bomb. The order was simple: get them moving or the front line dies here. Reports later showed 14 tanks disabled, 3 completely beyond recovery. The division was stuck halfway between supply lines and artillery cover. Somewhere beyond the tree line, German spotters watched through field glasses. One radioed back, confident, "They're finished. The Americans can't move their armor. We'll shell them at dawn." But the boy had other plans. He barked for spare lines, called for welding rods, used empty shell casings as clamps. The men around him followed without question. They called him Kid, but when he spoke they listened. He patched a radiator with a piece of flattened canteen, hammered a bent drive sprocket with the butt of his wrench. Each fix was temporary, but in war, temporary meant survival. The smell of antifreeze burned his nose. The hiss of leaking steam filled his ears. His gloves smoked when sparks jumped too close. Still he worked. "We're not dead yet," he muttered, half to himself, half to the machine. A German observer noted later, "They fix even while being fired upon. These Americans do not stop." But the convoy wasn't saved yet. The shelling would return before dawn. He looked up, mud in his hair, as lightning flashed across the valley. He had maybe 3 hours before the next barrage. 3 hours to bring steel back to life. Dawn didn't arrive quietly. The horizon cracked open with artillery thunder. Shells whistled overhead, shredding treetops and showering dirt across the stalled convoy. The boy didn't flinch. He was already under the second tank, torch in hand, fixing a ruptured fuel line that bled like a vein. Sparks danced against the steel belly, while tracer rounds zipped past. The hiss of his acetylene torch mixed with the deep, guttural rumble of nearby explosions, a soundtrack of chaos that didn't seem to touch him. He worked with surgical calm, his hands moved by instinct, sliding tools between bolts slick with oil. When the torch sputtered out, he switched to brute force, hammer, wrench, anything that would hold. The engine above him coughed once, then roared alive, shaking the ground. 1 down, 19 to go. "Get it moving," he yelled, voice cracking from smoke. The crew scrambled aboard, faces blackened by soot, and drove forward through the mud. The tank rolled past him like a reborn giant. Each Sherman weighed roughly 33 tons. Each required fuel, coolant, and miracles. He patched hull holes with scavenged metal, tightened bolts stripped bare, rewired communications using copper wire torn from broken radios. Every repair took an hour, sometimes less. A statistic later recorded by the division's maintenance log estimated he averaged 90 minutes per tank, under active fire. An enemy artillery observer, stunned by the persistence below, scribbled in his report, "They repair faster than we reload." The Germans had expected fear, they saw obsession instead. The boy's world shrank to the glow of the torch, the clang of metal, the rhythm of his own breathing. When shrapnel sliced across his shoulder, he taped it shut with field dressing and kept going. "Pain means you're not dead," he muttered. Another shell hit nearby, the concussion lifting him briefly off the ground. He rolled, spat out mud, and went right back under the next tank. By afternoon the field smelled of burned oil and rain. 5 tanks now rolled again. The others waited like sleeping beasts, cold and heavy. Around him, veterans exchanged looks, respect replacing doubt. The kid was turning chaos into motion. And as dusk fell again, he realized he couldn't stop now. Not when the older men had started following his lead. By the 3rd day, the convoy looked less like wreckage and more like a resurrection line. Tanks that had been silent now growled again, one after another, engines coughing back to life under rain and smoke. The boy hadn't slept in 36 hours. His uniform was stiff with mud and grease, his left sleeve dark with dried blood. When he walked through the rows of machines, older men stepped aside, some nodding without words. They'd stopped calling him kid. Now they called him the engineer. Inside the command tent, officers argued. He's a child, one said. He's the reason we're still rolling. Another snapped back. The debate ended when the colonel ordered coffee sent to the boy instead of questions. In war, results mattered more than birthdays. Out in the mud, he worked beside men twice his age, replacing a snapped track with rope and sheer willpower. It normally took 6 men, 2 jacks and 3 hours. He did it with 2 mechanics and a crowbar. Every clang of his hammer echoed across the valley. He barely spoke, but his focus was infectious. Soldiers from nearby platoons came just to watch him work. Someone started calling the repaired column the boy's army. The name stuck. Even the Germans noticed. A captured panzer crew muttered through the fence, "Our mechanics surrender faster." He had become a rhythm the division moved to. At dusk, when the engines cooled, he'd collapse beside them, eyes half open, breathing with the machines he'd revived. There was no ceremony, no cheering. Just quiet acknowledgement from men hardened by years of death, who suddenly found something worth admiring again. The division's maintenance officer started logging his output. By that evening, 12 tanks were operational, each stamped with his initials on the worksheet, R, L. That's the boy's mark, a driver said proudly. Still, the war around them hadn't paused. German guns were regrouping. Radio intercepts hinted at a counterattack. The boy leaned against a tank tread, hands trembling, and said softly, "Let them come. We'll just fix it again." When the first artillery flash lit the sky hours later, it was clear. The Germans were coming back for everything he'd just saved. By dawn, the horizon over Kassel flickered orange. Smoke columns rose like chimneys from a city that no longer belonged to anyone. The boy wiped grime from his face and looked down the valley road. What he saw didn't seem real. One by one, engines began to growl awake. The Shermans he'd resurrected the night before were lining up again, 20 armored beasts ready to roll. Their exhausts spat fire, their treads crushed the mud flat. He leaned on his wrench and exhaled. For the first time in days he smiled. Men cheered without orders. A sergeant slapped him on the shoulder. "You did it, kid. You actually did it." He just shook his head, dizzy from fatigue and fumes. Reports later confirmed it. 20 tanks revived in 36 hours, a feat no field unit had ever logged under active fire. Even the colonel, who'd once doubted his age, stepped out of his jeep and stared. "Get this boy a medal," someone said. No one wrote down his name. The convoy moved out. Engines rumbled like thunder rolling through the valley. German spotters watched through binoculars from the opposite ridge. One officer whispered, "They resurrected their machines." His artillery commander didn't answer. He was already retreating. The boy sat on the back of a truck, legs dangling, grease still on his hands. Around him, tanks he'd touched rumbled forward, cutting across terrain the Germans thought impassable. For him, the roar wasn't victory, it was relief. He'd kept them alive long enough to move. The 10th Armored Division pushed deeper into the collapsing German front that morning, and historians later wrote that the momentum shift began with a small field miracle of mechanical endurance. As the column disappeared into the haze, the boy's body finally gave up. He slumped against a fuel drum, eyes half closed, heartbeat syncing with the hum of departing engines. Nearby, medics thought he'd passed out from smoke. They didn't know he was listening, making sure every sound matched the rhythm of survival. By nightfall, radio reports confirmed, objective reached, resistance broken, but success brings attention, and attention brings questions. The next morning, High Command would arrive to see the so-called boy mechanic, and not everyone believed a kid could have done what veterans couldn't. By mid-morning, the roar of engines faded into a strange, uneasy quiet. The boy sat on an overturned crate, eating cold rations with trembling hands when a jeep approached from headquarters. Out stepped a colonel in a pressed uniform, boots spotless despite the mud. He looked at the tanks lined up at the smouldering field, then at the boy who could barely stay upright. "You the one they're talking about?" the colonel asked. The boy nodded, swallowing dry bread that felt like chalk. The officer studied him for a long second. Young face, cracked knuckles, eyes too old for 18. The colonel walked the line, running a glove across tank armor still warm from combat. He checked the maintenance sheets pinned to each turret initials R.L., scribbled beside every completed repair. 19 sheets, one unsigned because the boy had been too exhausted to finish writing. The officer turned back. "Where'd you learn to do this?" The boy shrugged. "Farm, broken tractors, same thing, just heavier." A few soldiers chuckled. The colonel didn't. He ordered the maintenance logs brought from the command tent. They confirmed 18 verified field repairs in 48 hours, all under bombardment. The statistics stunned even the paperwork clerks. Still, the colonel's tone was skeptical. "You expect me to believe a kid fixed what a whole depot couldn't?" he said quietly. The boy looked him dead in the eye and replied, "Sir, the tanks are moving. That's all that matters." Somewhere nearby, a captured German mechanic overheard and whispered to his guard, "We underestimated American mechanics." The guard grinned. Everyone does. For the first time, someone from command actually shook the boy's hand. "Good work, soldier," the colonel said at last. Then, softer, "Get some rest." But there was no rest. The boy knew attention came with a cost. Every rumor about the boy engineer spread through the regiment like static on the radio, stories stretched, exaggerated, questioned. That afternoon he found himself alone beside one of the repaired tanks, wiping grease from its side like it were a living thing. The engines purred, but beyond the hills, thunder rolled again, German artillery finding its aim. Recognition had lasted exactly 6 hours. The next barrage would test whether any of it even mattered. The first shells fell just after sunset. No warning, no pattern, just thunder tearing the air apart. The ground shook so hard it rattled the bolts on the nearest Sherman. The boy dove for cover behind a half-buried fuel drum as explosions stitched across the field. Fire rolled over the tanks he'd spent days reviving. For a moment the world was nothing but heat, sound and dust. He heard someone screaming orders that vanished into the barrage. The colonel's jeep flipped in the blast wave. Everything the division had rebuilt was under siege again. He scrambled back toward the nearest tank, low to the ground, boots sinking in wet mud. A direct hit had sheared the right tread clean off. Flames licked through the hull seams. Inside, the loader's voice shouted, "We're hit. Engines gone." The boy's instinct took over. Grab wrench, grab wire, move. He ducked under the hull as shrapnel hissed overhead, sparks bouncing off steel. The air smelled like burning paint and hot oil. In 10 minutes, 2 German artillery rounds slammed into the valley. Reports later noted this counterattack was the heaviest bombardment that sector had seen in 2 weeks. The boy felt each one like a heartbeat through the ground. When the dust cleared for a second, he saw silhouettes moving on the far ridge. Panzer Roman 4 edging forward through the smoke. Inside a ruined trench, a captured German radio operator shouted over the din, "They'll break this time. The Americans can't hold." He was wrong. The boy tied down a ruptured line with wire stripped from a destroyed half-track, twisted it tight until his fingers bled, and slapped the side of the tank. "Try it now." The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught. The roar drowned out everything. Around him, soldiers who'd been crouched in cover rose and started firing again. The revived tank rolled forward, turret swiveling to return fire. Even in the chaos, the boy grinned, half disbelief, half defiance. He was too tired to feel fear anymore. The valley lit up as both sides exchanged fire, steel against steel. When the guns finally paused, smoke still clung to the earth. The boy leaned against the tank's tread, chest heaving, eyes scanning for movement. Then someone yelled, a crew trapped inside a burning Sherman up ahead. He dropped his wrench and ran. The cry for help sliced through the smoke. 2 crewmen were trapped inside a Sherman hit square on the turret ring. Ammo cooking off inside, flames licking through the open hatch. The boy didn't think, he just ran. His boots sank in mud thick with oil, jacket sleeves catching sparks as he climbed the hull. The metal was searing hot. Every breath burned. He yanked the hatch handle. It wouldn't move. Inside, someone was pounding from the other side. Help, can't get out. The air shimmered with heat. He tore off his gloves and wrapped a rag around his hand, pulling until the latch gave with a scream of metal. A blast of black smoke poured out, choking him. He dropped low, coughing, eyes watering. Come on! He shouted, reaching into the furnace. He grabbed the first man by his vest and dragged him out, boots slipping. The second was pinned. His leg caught under a twisted seat frame. He crawled in deeper, the world turning orange. Rounds inside the tank began to detonate, one after another, each crack shaking the hull. Reports later estimated the internal temperature reached over 800 degrees Fahrenheit before the hull split. He found a pry bar, wedged it beneath the seat, and pushed until his muscles screamed. The frame bent, freeing the man's leg. Together they stumbled out, collapsing in the mud as the tank exploded behind them, turret lifting clean off. Medics rushed forward. The boy's hair was singed, his eyebrows gone, his skin streaked with soot and blood. One medic tried to pull him away, but he refused until both crewmen were clear. Their breathing, he gasped. That's all that matters. Later, a German medic captured nearby would write in his report, no German would do that for a machine. They treat their tanks as if they were people. It wasn't heroism to the boy. It was duty. Those tanks weren't just machines. They were lifelines, homes, shields for the men inside. He watched the burning wreck slump into silence, flames reflecting off his eyes. Behind him, the sky still glowed red from the barrage. Somewhere in that light, he realized what he'd become, someone who fixed things no matter how broken they were. The colonel's voice cut through the smoke, get that kid to a medic, but by morning the paperwork would forget again. When the guns finally went silent, dawn arrived like an apology. The valley was a graveyard of armor, German and American alike. Smoking, gutted, still warm from the night's fight. The boy sat on a ration crate near a tank that no longer had a turret, arms folded tight against the cold. He had no feeling left in his hands. Around him, medics counted the living and the lost. Someone brought coffee. It tasted of ashes. Within hours, word of the boy engineer spread beyond the division. Journalists at the rear heard whispers. A kid who fixed 20 tanks and pulled men from fire. A clerk typed up a recommendation for commendation, maybe even a Bronze Star. The colonel signed it without hesitation. But then the front moved. The papers got buried under new orders, and the war didn't pause to honor one grease-covered teenager. In the following weeks, the division pushed deeper into Germany. The boy kept working quietly, refusing interviews. Machines don't care about medals, he told a driver who tried to thank him. Reports show that his file, along with thousands of others, was sent to St. Louis for record-keeping. There it vanished, part of the 1973 National Archives fire that destroyed over 400 Army service records. His name faded into paperwork smoke. Decades later, when veterans gathered in small town halls and sour VFW bars, they'd mention him. That kid saved us at Castle, they'd say. No one ever remembered his full name, just the boy who fixed everything. The army never issued the medal. The official commendation line on his record was left blank. A former German POW, interviewed years later, told a historian they forgot their own heroes. He fought the way we wished our officers had, against despair itself. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The boy went home after the surrender without ceremony, stepping off a troop train that no one met. No photographs, no parades, just a duffel bag that smelled of oil and rain. In his pocket, the wrench he'd carried through every battle. He looked at it one last time before throwing it in a shed. War's over, he muttered, but memory doesn't end with the paperwork. And somewhere across the ocean, the men he saved were still telling his story. To anyone who'd listen in the ruins of post-war Germany, Allied interrogators collected thousands of testimonies, engineers, tank crews, prisoners, each recounting fragments of memory. Among the reports from captured mechanics in 1946, one detail kept surfacing: a young American boy who worked under fire, repairing tanks faster than shells could land. They didn't know his name, but they all remembered his hands, small, fast, relentless. A German engineer named Otto Riener sketched his face from memory during an interview in Darmstadt. The drawing showed a boy with oil streaks under his eyes and a bandage tied over one arm. He wasn't fighting us, Riener said, sliding the pencil aside. He was fighting time. Another prisoner, a panzer mechanic from Kassel, confirmed the same scene. I saw him from across the field under a Sherman. We were told Americans had endless replacements. I realized then they also had endless will. These recollections found their way into the U.S. Army Historical Division archives. Reports indicate that between 1946 and 1947, over 30 captured Axis engineers referenced the boy mechanic during debriefings on Allied logistics. To them, he represented something terrifying, not firepower, but endurance. One note written in faded ink read, "Their machines die, and they resurrect them before we can destroy them again." For the boy himself, none of this mattered. He never saw the interviews, never knew that his ghost lingered in German notebooks. While he rebuilt his quiet life in Kansas, across an ocean, his legend became the enemy's metaphor for American resolve. A German historian decades later summarized it best: "He was a child of industry, not ideology. To us, he proved the war was lost before it ended." What the Germans remembered wasn't victory or defeat. It was the sight of one kid refusing to stop, even when the world around him did. And in that memory lay a strange respect, something unspoken between enemies who had both run out of reasons. Those reports would later inspire documentaries, books, and lectures, but his identity remained uncertain, his name lost, his face blurred between stories. Still, the myth lived on, stitched into history through the very voices that once tried to destroy him. And among those voices grew a deeper realization: the boy was just a symbol of something much bigger than himself, the machine that built him. By 1945, German commanders had stopped underestimating American factories. Reports from the Ruhr front described not just endless tanks, but the eerie rhythm of replacement: destroy one, and another appeared within days. Behind every soldier, like the boy engineer, stood an empire of logistics, roaring like a machine with no off switch. To the enemy, that was the real superweapon. In captured diaries, Wehrmacht officers wrote with disbelief, "They repair faster than we destroy." Those words echoed through interrogation files and post-war studies. The truth was staggering. The United States produced over 49 0.00 Sherman tanks during the war, one every 38 minutes at peak production. Detroit's auto lines had turned into war lines, steel flowing instead of cars. Conveyor belts ran 24 hours, 7 days a week, under banners that read, "Keep 'em rolling." The boy in the field was the final gear in that monstrous system, one pair of hands closing the circuit between industry and battlefield. He wasn't alone. Mechanics like him stretched from Normandy to the Pacific, each a silent extension of factories thousands of miles away. The Germans saw the pattern too late. They could destroy a division, but not a supply chain that stretched across oceans. When Allied forces overran a captured panzer repair depot near Cologne, they found a blackboard with chalked words: Amerikaner haben kein Angst vor Verschleiß. Americans have no fear of wear and tear. It wasn't meant as praise, just exhausted recognition. A surviving German colonel admitted to historians, "We thought we were fighting men. We were fighting their production." For the boy, the industrial tide was invisible. He saw only the broken things in front of him. Cracked hoses, seized engines, leaking fuel. But every time he fixed one, somewhere in Michigan another rolled off the line to take its place. The system fed itself through effort like his. That realization, the scale, the speed, the inevitability crushed German morale long before Berlin fell. Even the propaganda couldn't hide the truth. America's strength wasn't its generals or slogans. It was the kid with a wrench under fire. By April's end, the boy's unit crossed the Rhine, engines roaring with the power of a continent. Ahead lay victory, but behind him lay the lesson the enemy could never unlearn. April 1945. The Rhine shimmered under a pale grey sky, bridges half collapsed, water thick with debris and diesel slicks. The boy engineer stood beside the same tanks he had nursed back to life, now lined up like giants along the riverbank. The 10th Armoured Division was preparing to cross. Engines throbbed, cables groaned, and the wind carried the faint echo of church bells from the opposite shore. Germany was bleeding out, but the river still divided two worlds, defeat and survival. He crouched by a Sherman's track, checking the bolts one last time. The machines had become familiar to him, each scar and dent a memory. A sergeant nearby shouted over the roar. Orders just came. "We cross at first light." The boy nodded, tightening the last nut, feeling the vibration of 1,000 engines humming in unison. The scale of the operation was staggering. More than 300 Zeros, Zero Allied troops would cross the Rhine within 10 days. To the Germans still defending the far bank, it looked impossible, an army building bridges faster than they could destroy them. Artillery thundered, smoke drifted low, and American engineers hauled pontoon sections into place while under sniper fire. From the opposite ridge, a German captain stared through binoculars. "Es ist vorbei," he muttered, "it's over." What he saw wasn't just an army advancing. It was momentum incarnate, machines, men and mechanics moving as one. When the first tanks rolled onto the temporary bridge, steel creaked but held. The boy rode atop one, eyes fixed on the ruined skyline ahead. The air smelled of cold river water and engine fumes. Beneath him, the bridge flexed like muscle. Every vibration reminded him of the countless bolts he'd turned, the parts he'd saved. He wasn't crossing for glory. He was crossing because his work had made it possible. Midway across, the sky broke open with rain. The drops hissed against hot armor, steam rising like ghosts from the river. The boy looked down and saw his reflection ripple between the girders, a kid who had walked through fire and come out forged. On the far shore, the tanks rolled onto German soil again, guns silent for now. The boy exhaled, unaware that this crossing marked the last mission before everything would finally stop moving. The guns went quiet in May, just like that. No thunder, no command, just a silence so deep it felt heavier than artillery. The boy stood beside a tank he'd kept alive since winter, hand resting on the cold armor that no longer rumbled. Around him, soldiers were laughing, smoking, or staring blankly at nothing. He couldn't join them. For months, the roar of engines had been his heartbeat. Now the stillness made him uneasy. He walked across the abandoned camp, stepping over discarded shells and torn canvas. The air smelled of rust and spring rain. The war was over, but the world hadn't caught up yet. Trucks rumbled east, carrying prisoners. Others headed west, filled with tired men going home. The boy didn't know which direction he belonged in. When he finally boarded a ship back to the States, the Atlantic stretched flat and endless. The engines droned like a lullaby. He kept to himself, tinkering with a broken radio, trying to fill the silence. Back home, the Kansas sky looked too wide, too calm. His mother said he was taller, older. He didn't feel either. He went back to fixing machines, tractors, trucks, anything that made noise. Neighbors came by just to watch him work, the same quiet precision, the same habit of wiping his hands twice before speaking. Reports from the Veterans Administration years later noted that over 60% of combat mechanics struggled to adjust to civilian life. The boy never talked about the war. When asked, he'd just say, "Engines don't shoot back." Sometimes, late at night, he'd step outside, hearing echoes of tank engines in the wind. The sounds weren't real, but his hands would twitch, remembering the rhythm of bolts and wrenches. Machines were still his language, silence never was. A friend once told a local reporter, "He talks to engines like they're people." Maybe that was true. Each machine he fixed was another way to make peace with the ghosts that never left him. In time, the town forgot what he'd done. He married, raised kids, built a small repair shop by the highway. The sign read simply, R.L. Repairs, we fix everything. He never mentioned where those initials came from, and decades later, someone found one of his tanks again. Decades passed before anyone pieced the story back together. A rusted Sherman, found half, buried in a European field, drew the attention of a restoration team from a U.S. military museum. Under layers of grime they found faint markings, small letters etched into the metal with a screwdriver, R.L., April 1945. The initials matched records from the 10th Armored Division's lost maintenance logs. The curators didn't know it yet, but they'd uncovered the ghost of the boy engineer. When the tank was restored, the weld seams looked rough, almost desperate, hasty field repairs done under fire. Experts confirmed the technique matched frontline improvisations taught to mechanics during the final months of the war. This wasn't factory work, one historian said. This was survival work. The exhibit opened in 1995, 50 years after the war ended. Veterans who visited paused at that one tank longer than the rest. They'd whisper the same phrase, "That kid saved us." The museum plaque reads simply, "Unknown Engineer, 10th Armored Division, Kassel, April 1945. No medals, no rank, no name. Just the story." Reports estimate that fewer than 5% of frontline armor mechanics from that division survived to see peace. The boy was likely one of the lucky few, but his legacy lived through the steel he'd resurrected. Visitors still stop by the display. Some trace their fingers over the etched initials, wondering who he was. Others see more than a soldier. They see the spirit of a generation that rebuilt instead of surrendered. His story became a quiet symbol in documentaries and history circles, proof that heroism doesn't always fire a gun. A German historian who once studied the captured reports later wrote, "He fixed death itself." That line became the closing caption of a short film about him, played in classrooms and museums around the world. The boy never sought recognition, never imagined strangers would one day tell his story. But history has a way of repairing what time forgets. The tank he saved outlasted every man who fought beside it, and in that machine's reflection under museum lights and glass, his legend still hums softly, like an engine waiting to start again.